Imagine a governor at the height of her power, cameras flashing, supporters cheering, her words, sharp and polished, shaping the image of control. But what if I told you that behind the smile, cracks were forming? What if the leader who projected strength was standing on a foundation ready to collapse? For Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the illusion of power was everything. She wielded it like armor, projecting certainty in a world of chaos. But illusions never last forever. And one voice, one challenger was about to tear that armor apart. At first, it looked like any other press conference. Sanders stood before the podium, speaking of values, of principles, of leadership. She spoke with conviction, like she always did. Her allies clapped, reporters scribbled notes. But outside that room, another current was building. A voice not yet amplified, a voice waiting to strike. That voice belonged to Jasmine Crockett. Sanders didn't know it yet, not fully, not in the way she was about to. But Crockett was already circling, already watching, already waiting for the perfect opening. And when it came, it would not be subtle. It would be explosive. Sanders had weathered critics before. She had sparred with the press, with rivals, with activists. She had built her reputation on control, composure, and the ability to twist narratives back in her favor. But Crockett was different. She wasn't playing by the same rules. She wasn't afraid of the backlash. She wanted to drag hypocrisy into the light, no matter how high the cost. The first shots were subtle. Crockett called out contradictions in Sanders' speeches, her policies, her claims of integrity, small jabs, easily ignored. Sanders dismissed them with a smile, a quip, a deflection. But Crockett didn't stop. She kept coming, louder, sharper, more direct. The public began to notice. Clips circulated on social media. Hashtags caught fire. People who once shrugged now leaned forward. And in the shadows of politics, whispers grew louder. Could Sanders actually be vulnerable? Inside the governor's circle, confidence wavered. Advisors reminded her, "Ignore it. You're untouchable." But Sanders knew better. She could feel it. The ground shifting beneath her. The illusion weakening. Because every empire has its crack. And Crockett had found hers. At first, Sanders believed she could spin it, control it. She doubled down on speeches, on interviews, on rehearsed performances of strength, but the footage didn't lie. When Crockett spoke, it cut deeper than spin. It wasn't just criticism, it was exposure. And exposure is dangerous. Sanders began lashing out behind closed doors. Her staff noticed the change. The once calculated leader now snapped at small mistakes, demanded tighter control of press access, ordered rehearsed answers for every possible question. But the truth? No rehearsal could prepare her for what was coming. Because Crockett wasn't slowing down. She was preparing to go public and direct. The stage was set. The challenger was ready. And the illusion of power was about to shatter. But how exactly does a leader lose control? Not in one sudden strike, but in a series of small collapses, each one chipping away until the mask falls completely. And the first collapse was just around the corner. The first real crack came quietly. Not with shouting, not with chaos, but with a single question. A reporter asked, almost casually, "Governor, how do you reconcile your stance on transparency with the secrecy of your office's recent decisions?" Sanders froze for a split second. The cameras caught it. The hesitation. The eyes darting. The carefully rehearsed armor slipping. Her answer was polished, of course. Smooth. Controlled. The kind of response you'd expect from a seasoned politician. But the freeze, the pause, it lingered. And Crockett saw it. She pounced. At her next appearance, Crockett mocked the hesitation word for word. She says transparency, but watch the tape, even she couldn't say it with a straight face. The audience laughed. The clip spread. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Sanders' words, it was about her credibility. Every empire fears mockery. Because once people start laughing at power, power begins to crumble. Sanders' team scrambled. They insisted she was still strong, still respected, still untouchable. But in living rooms, in coffee shops, in the endless scroll of social media feeds, the laughter grew, and Crockett was smiling. The challenger had found her rhythm. She wasn't just pointing out hypocrisy, she was framing Sanders as a symbol of it. Every contradiction, every gap, every polished lie, Crockett dragged it into the spotlight. And the people listened. Sanders lashed out behind closed doors. She's nothing. She's irrelevant. Why are people even paying attention? But the anger only fueled her downfall. Because every outburst leaked. Every whisper spread. Every display of weakness fed the fire. The governor who once commanded silence now found herself mocked, questioned, doubted. And for Crockett, this was only the beginning. Because she was saving her sharpest strike for later. The strike that would not just embarrass Sanders but break her. The tension built week by week. Crockett grew louder. Sanders grew angrier. Their words collided in headlines, their faces side by side on television screens. The feud became impossible to ignore. And when their paths finally crossed in public, the air itself seemed to spark. It was supposed to be a routine event, a policy debate, cameras, reporters, a packed room. Sanders stepped in with her usual confidence, her rehearsed lines tucked neatly into her memory. But Crockett was there too, waiting, watching, and ready. The moment Sanders finished her speech, Crockett rose. Her voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the applause. "You talk about values," she said, eyes locked on Sanders. "But when it comes to living them, where are you? Where is your integrity?" The room went silent. Reporters lifted pens. Cameras zoomed in. Sanders smirked. She tried to brush it off, to dismiss Crockett with a line about divisive politics. But Crockett didn't back down. Her words grew stronger, her accusations sharper, and Sanders began to stumble. The illusion of control slipped further. The crowd noticed. The cameras noticed. And when Sanders snapped, voice raised, eyes blazing, it was over. The footage spread like wildfire, not as strength, not as confidence, but as proof. Proof that Crockett had struck the nerve Sanders wanted hidden. Proof that the mask of power could break. And once the mask breaks, you can never put it back together. Sanders retreated. Her team tried to downplay it, to shift the story. But the clip had already gone viral. Crockett's words echoed everywhere. And the question on everyone's lips was simple. If Sanders can't handle one challenger, how can she handle leadership? The illusion shattered further. The cracks widened. And Sanders, once untouchable, now looked fragile. But this was still just the build-up, because the real unraveling, the collapse of control, hadn't even begun. The cracks were no longer hidden. They were on full display, and everyone could see them. But Sanders still believed she could fix it. She doubled down, more speeches, more appearances, more interviews, each one crafted to project strength. And yet, each one chipped further at her image. Because people weren't just watching her words anymore. They were watching her expressions, her tone, the way she snapped when pressed, the way her smile faltered when challenged. And every time, Crockett was there to seize the moment. Crockett wasn't simply exposing hypocrisy. She was framing it, shaping the narrative in a way that Sanders couldn't escape. Every contradiction became a headline. Every hesitation became a meme. Every outburst became a symbol. And slowly, the public began asking questions they hadn't dared to before. Is she really who she says she is? Does she even believe her own words? Or is this all performance? Sanders' allies noticed the shift. They urged her to ignore Crockett, to rise above the attacks. But Sanders couldn't. Not anymore. She was obsessed. She demanded constant updates on Crockett's appearances. She raged when her name trended online. She barked orders at her staff to shut this down, but no one knew how. Because Crockett wasn't playing politics. She was playing something far more dangerous. She was playing truth. And truth has a way of spreading like wildfire, The showdown became inevitable. Reporters sensed it. Audiences craved it. The story was no longer just about policy. It was about personality, about integrity, about the clash between two women who refused to back down. When they faced each other again, the energy was electric. Cameras crowded, the room buzzed, the air seemed heavier, thicker, as if everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Sanders began with confidence, reciting familiar lines. But Crockett stood still, silent, watching her. And when the governor finally paused, Crockett struck. Her voice rang out, sharp and undeniable. You tell us you stand for honesty, but every action proves otherwise. You demand accountability, but when will you hold? In that, you're self-accountable. The crowd gasped. Sanders stiffened. Her face betrayed what her words could not hide. She tried to counterattack. She accused Crockett of lies, of exaggerations, of playing politics. But Crockett didn't flinch. She stepped closer. Her words grew harder. And then, the question. A question so precise, so damning, that Sanders couldn't answer. You call yourself a leader, Crockett said slowly, every syllable like a strike. But tell us when you demand sacrifice from others. What sacrifice have you ever made yourself? The silence was deafening. Reporters leaned forward. The governor's lips parted, but no words came. She stammered. She shifted. She tried to deflect. But the damage was done. The clip exploded online. Millions watched, millions shared. And for the first time, the public didn't just question Sanders' policies. They questioned her humanity. The mask was gone. The illusion shattered. And Sanders lost it. Behind closed doors, she screamed at her staff. She demanded loyalty tests. She fired aides at random. She ranted about betrayal, about conspiracies, about being targeted. The pressure consumed her. And the more she lashed out, the more it leaked. Every story that escaped painted her not as strong, but as unstable. And Crockett only needed to say one thing. This is what happens when power is built on lies. What? The escalation had begun. The fall was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. But what came next was worse than anyone expected. Because Sanders wasn't just fighting Crockett anymore. She was fighting herself. The whispers grew louder. First in back rooms, then in headlines, and finally in the homes of ordinary people. Sanders was no longer feared. She was pitied, or worse, ridiculed. Clips of her meltdowns surfaced one after another, her voice cracking under pressure, her temper flaring when asked simple questions, her carefully sculpted persona of calm leadership dissolving in real time. And Jasmine Crockett? She barely had to lift a finger anymore. All she did was highlight the truth, replay the clips, ask the questions everyone else was already thinking. And every time she did, the cracks in Sanders' armor spread wider. But Sanders couldn't stop. She went on the attack, doubling down with harsher rhetoric, desperate to regain control. She branded Crockett as unhinged, radical, dangerous. But the words didn't stick, because each time she said them, the public remembered the clips, her clips of rage, of hypocrisy, of unraveling. And when Crockett finally responded, it was surgical. She didn't shout. She didn't rant. She simply asked, with a calm, deliberate tone, why does the governor call others unhinged when it's her behavior that proves otherwise? What proves otherwise? The silence that followed was deafening. Audiences didn't laugh this time. They nodded. They whispered. They agreed. Sanders felt it. The walls closing in. The empire crumbling. Her team scrambled to contain the fallout. They staged controlled interviews. They filtered questions. They tried to shield her from moments of exposure. But Crockett had shifted the battlefield. It wasn't about policy anymore. It wasn't about debate points or talking heads. It was about trust, character, the intangible essence of leadership. and Sanders had lost it. Behind the scenes, even allies grew restless. Donors whispered. Advisors distanced themselves. And still, Sanders raged. Every room she entered felt colder, more uncertain. Every speech carried the weight of suspicion. But what came next was the breaking point. Because Sanders, desperate to prove her strength, staged an event designed to silence the critics once and for all. A fiery speech. A grand promise. A declaration of dominance. And Crockett was there, watching, waiting. The cameras rolled as Sanders thundered about values, about accountability, about the so-called hypocrisy of her opponents. She raised her voice. She slammed her fist. She demanded respect. And Crockett smiled. Not with amusement, but with purpose. When Sanders paused, catching her breath, Crockett rose. You stand here preaching accountability, she said slowly, deliberately. But the only one you refuse to hold accountable is yourself. The crowd froze. Sanders snapped her head toward her, eyes blazing. And in that instant, she lost it. Her voice cracked. Her words turned into shouts. Her fury, her frustration, her fear, all of it spilled out, raw and uncontrolled, under the unblinking gaze of the cameras. The meltdown wasn't a rumor anymore. It was reality, broadcast, immortalized. And as the footage spread, something shifted permanently. The governor who once demanded silence now couldn't escape the sound of laughter. The leader who once controlled the room now couldn't even control herself. And Crockett? She didn't need to celebrate, because the world was already doing it for her. But this was not the end. It was only the storm before the collapse. Because once a leader unravels in public, the real question isn't if they'll fall. It's how fast, asterisk. The storm had reached its peak. There was no turning back now. Sarah Huckabee Sanders stood at the center of chaos she had once controlled. But control was gone. Shattered. Her image once untouchable, now a punchline. Her words once commanding, now hollow echoes. And everywhere she turned, Jasmine Crockett was there. Not with anger, not with fury, but with truth. And that truth burned hotter than any insult Sanders could throw. The public demanded answers. The media swarmed. And finally, the stage was set for what would become the defining confrontation. A televised forum, national stage, millions watching. No scripts, no shields, just questions and answers. Sanders walked in first, chin high, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew what was coming. She had felt it building for weeks. And Crockett? She didn't march in. She didn't storm. She glided, asterisk, calm, composed, a force of stillness. The first questions were easy. Policy, budget, infrastructure. Sanders delivered rehearsed lines, but the crowd didn't cheer. They listened, with doubt. They listened, with suspicion. Then came the pivot. The questions no staffer could spin away. The questions about integrity, about trust, about hypocrisy. Sanders' words grew sharp, defensive. She snapped at the moderator. She bristled at the tone. She lashed out at bias and attacks. And then Crockett leaned forward. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the noise. You say you lead with values, she said, but when those values are tested, you break. So I'll ask you this. If leadership means accountability, why do you run from your own reflection? The audience erupted. Not with cheers, not with laughter, but with gasps. Sanders froze. Her lips moved, but no words came. Her face hardened, but her voice faltered. She tried. She tried to deflect, to accuse, to rage. But the weight of the silence crushed her, and the cameras captured everything. Her anger, her stumbles, her unraveling. Crockett didn't press further. She didn't need to, because the silence was louder than any argument. The moderator asked again. Sanders shouted. Crockett sat still. The moderator pressed. Sanders sputtered. Crockett remained calm. And in those minutes, the contrast was undeniable. One woman clinging to control with fists of rage. Another standing steady with the power of composure. The clip spread within hours. By morning, it was everywhere. Commentators called it the moment the mask fell. Pundits said, the governor lost the war with a single silence. And Sanders? She didn't just lose the argument. She lost herself. Behind closed doors, the fury turned to despair. Her allies abandoned her. Her staff whispered about resignations. Her donors fled. But the people? They had already decided. For them, the showdown wasn't just political. It was personal. A reflection of something deeper. A question of who to trust, who to believe, who to follow. And in that test, Sanders failed. Crockett didn't just expose hypocrisy. She dismantled it. The fall wasn't a headline anymore. It was history. But the story wasn't over. Because when power collapses, something always rises to take its place. And the world began asking, if Sanders had fallen, what would Crockett do with the light now shining on her? The dust never truly settles after a collapse. It hangs in the air, thick, heavy, lingering. Sarah Huckabee Sanders had fallen. Not from an election defeat, not from a scandal in the traditional sense, but from something far more permanent, from the loss of trust, from the exposure of hypocrisy, from the unraveling of her own image. The meltdown, the silence, the showdown, each moment stacked upon the last until the weight became unbearable. The governor's office tried damage control. Statements released, interviews staged, excuses spun. But the people didn't buy it. They had seen the cracks. They had heard the rage. They had watched the unraveling with their own eyes. And no amount of spin could erase what was already etched into memory. Jasmine Crockett? She didn't declare victory. She didn't gloat. She didn't even need to speak, because the narrative had shifted on its own. From Sanders the strong to Sanders the broken. From the governor's authority to the governor's hypocrisy. And Crockett stood as the mirror. Calm, steady. The woman who asked the questions Sanders could never answer. But behind the calm, Crockett knew the truth. This wasn't just about Sanders. This was about something bigger. A system built on performance. A culture that worshipped image. A political machine that cracked when pressed with real accountability. And people began to wonder, if Sanders could unravel so quickly, how many others stood on the same fragile foundation? The whispers grew. Who's next? Whose mask will fall? And the tension stretched beyond Arkansas. National commentators dissected the footage. Clips replayed on primetime. Politicians across the spectrum stiffened because if she could be exposed, maybe they could too. Meanwhile, Sanders retreated. Public appearances shrank. Press conferences cut short. The once commanding figure now moved like a shadow of herself, and every time she tried to stand tall, the echoes of Crockett's words lingered. If leadership means accountability, why do you run from your own reflection? That line stuck, tattooed into the public consciousness, carved into political memory. Sanders couldn't escape it. Crockett didn't need to repeat it. The world did it for her. And so the fallout wasn't just political. It was cultural. A shift in how people saw power. A reminder that rage is not strength. That shouting is not leadership. That masks eventually crack. But even as Sanders' star dimmed, a new question arose. What about Crockett? What happens when the one who exposes becomes the one in the spotlight? Because exposure cuts both ways. And while Sanders fell under the weight of her own hypocrisy, Crockett now carried something heavier. Expectation. Would she rise to the occasion? Would she prove that calm and truth could stand against rage and illusion? Or would the same spotlight that burned Sanders eventually turn, hotter and harsher, on her? The story ended, but the echoes remained. The laughter, the silence, the cracks in the mask. Sanders had lost it all. Crockett had revealed it all. And the world was left to wonder, if this was only the beginning, who would be next to fall? Because in politics, the masks are many, and the cracks are everywhere.